Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Connect Live and iManage Work Security 101. Welcome to the session. I'd like to do a little introduction before we get started. My name is Chuck Davis. I'm president and co-founder of Adaptive Solutions. Been in the legal technology industry for about 25 to 30 years. Prior to founding Adaptive, was an in-house legal IT director for two large firms in the Philadelphia area. We've been an iManage Premier Partner since our inception 20 years ago. To my right is Nick Samodurov and Matthew Hartel. I'll let you guys both say hello.
Hi everybody, my name is Nick Samodurov. I'm the Principal Security Architect at Adaptive Solutions. I've been consulting primarily for law firms for the past several years, helping design infrastructure, advising sort of a CIO capacity, as well as implementing security controls and developing information governance. Before that, kind of a wide range of experience in different security environments, helping with information assurance and things along those lines and some sensitive government applications. And actually spent some time doing pen testing and web application testing as well.
Thanks, and Matt?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Hartel, and I am an enterprise solutions architect at Adaptive Solutions. I spent 14 years at a large Philadelphia law firm supporting their applications, including iManage, so I have a little bit of a broad spectrum of knowledge for legal. And now, in the past 2.5 years, I've been focused on iManage almost exclusively with Adaptive Solutions, putting mostly cloud in place. So we'll be talking a lot about that in our presentation.
So thanks for coming. What we're going to do is give you a quick background on the company, a little bit about who we are and what we do, and spend the vast majority of our time talking about security specific to iManage. So as I mentioned, we've been around about 20 years. This is our 20th anniversary this year. And very proud to say, as Matt had mentioned, that we're doing a lot of work specifically in the iManage cloud. Interestingly enough, we were just recently doing some studies on the projects that we've been conducting, and over the past 2 years, we've migrated 24 organizations, or just over 24 organizations, to the iManage cloud, roughly one every month at the clip that we're going, which is really interesting because we're finding that the cloud is secure, it is robust, and iManage has provided us as an integrator and you guys as customers with a platform that's actually ready for prime time. The other thing is that we work in the industry of legal and corporate legal, and we're seeing a lot of adoption in the corporate legal space right now. It seems to be the busy area. I think the in-house counsels are finding out they want the same tools that you folks at the law firms have had before. So when we go through today, we're going to talk a little bit about the technology, but what we're going to focus on is a new acronym that we came up with that we like to call the ACE security model. If you leave Connect Live with one thought and you're thinking about security specific to iManage, we want you to think about the ACE security model. We're not really going to dive in this session into technologies like security policy manager or threat manager, behavioral analysis, internal threats. We're talking more about the technology itself and how to establish secure connections, how to communicate effectively with the cloud, and how to secure the data through encryption. All right, so ACE is going through those three steps. What we'll do is we'll follow that throughout the whole process, with A for authentication, meaning the actual single sign-on or the security identifier that we're connecting with, C for communication being the protocol, and E being for encryption and how you're securing that data either in the cloud or on your premise. Before I hand off to Matt and Nick, I want to talk a little bit about the evolution and how we got here and why security is so important. iManage, as you all know, has been at this for quite some time, going back to the early days. And if you remember NetWrite Technologies, we were just getting around those days. And if you've been in this business long enough, you probably remember the proverbial profile card. The world we lived in 20 years ago was a much different world for document management. It wasn't enterprise content management. It was back in the dark days of WordPerfect and those types of things, right? But what ended up happening is our friend Cro-Magnon man walked up right to his computer and wanted to use technology in a different way. And those people today are walking to alternate devices. Devices like the tablet, the smartphone, Mac devices are becoming more and more popular in the industry. So what's changing in the market is people want ubiquitous access to this technology from any device and anywhere they're working. And in the case of the law firm, the client, or in the case of the corporate law department, the company is regulating those standards. They're being pushed down. So what we hope to do today over the next 30 or 35 minutes is explain a little bit to you about what's happening and what you should think through as you go through these security changes. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Matt, who's going to take us through the first part.
Okay, so I am a softball coach, and one of the things that I struggle with being a softball coach is I coach my 9-year-old daughter in softball. They hit the ball, nobody knows what to do. Okay, the ball goes out, they stand there like this. What I found was interesting, even though we've gone through a sales process at Adaptive and we've gone through explaining the process of iManage Cloud or iManage On-Prem, a lot of times when we get to security, there's kind of this blank look on everybody's face. And if there's not a blank look, there's a blank pause on the other end of the phone because we spend a lot of our time working remotely. So the goal here in doing work 10, and this is what this session is about, is to ultimately work through mobility, right? That's the goal here, to get this web interface, what Chuck's talking about, that evolution of the DMS, which is going to the cloud, going to web, and we want to be able to make it secure. So the goal here is web enabled, anywhere, anytime, okay? Now, and as I was watching at the beginning of the session, I noticed most of you are on mobile devices, right? You're not opening up your laptop, you're on a mobile device, you want to be able to get to your system. You want to be able to work as you need to work, okay? So you don't want to make your spouse or your significant other angry by opening up your laptop, sitting there waiting, when you just need to answer a simple question that's been asked of you. And so you need to get to your document real quick, you answer your question, you close the document, you're done. That's the goal, but we also want to make that secure. Globalization is an interesting thing too. Some of the clients that we have have a global presence, and we've found that a lot of the thick clients, which I'll just talk to in just a minute, the thick clients don't perform well, right? You talk about going around the other side of the world, the APAC, or if they have an office in, say, Singapore, or even more remote than that, say Africa, Europe. So the round trip time of connecting the desk site and file site client causes performance to be terrible. So the web performance is going to be significantly better. And I'm going to be in India in about 36 hours, and I'll try my web client, and I'll tell you if it's better than if it is here. So we're getting out of the thick client business. The thick client business, the desk site, file site, registry settings, the MSIs, we want to go towards the real thin web client that we have now. We have you go to the website, you install a small add-on on your device with Office already installed, and you get a thin web client for your dialog instead of the thick client dialog that you normally have with desk site. Most people want to turn on their laptop, put in their password, their dual factor, start up Outlook, have it connect, and they're in. That's another goal here. We talk about mobility, but we also talk about a good user experience. VPNs and VDI tend to lack in some areas in the user experience. So the goal here is to get a better user experience using iManage. As I mentioned, the move to Office 365, instant-on technology with Win 10. Win 10 is a big driver for a lot of your Work 10 upgrades. Now, Nick's going to talk about, from the security perspective, what's changing the game.
What's changing the game around security? I have an advantage in that a lot of the concepts around security apply both for on-premise and cloud solutions, particularly the ACE model that we talked about. And a lot of what's changing the game around security really falls into three categories that we're seeing. The primary motivator is the security audit, the client assessment, the questionnaires. That for several years now has been a main motivator for instigating change inside of the legal community. I expect that to continue to be the case. What's really driving that is you have clients, corporate financial clients, the heavy hitters that have been investing heavily in their security programs internally. And at a certain point, they realized that the investment really wasn't worthwhile if, as soon as they gave that information to a vendor, that they lost it somehow by not properly protecting it. So to drive change in their vendors, they very regularly use the questionnaires repeatedly. They come often. Or they have auditors come out and check. So that's going to continue to be the case. I view this as a very reactive form of security. Organizations generally will go through their assessments, their audits. They'll find specific security controls that their client wants to see, and they'll slap them in as quickly as possible, whether it's a full solution or they very quickly reconfigure things to meet the specific demands of that assessment or that audit. Sometimes those ad hoc solutions don't necessarily improve security much for a firm. Security is kind of unique to each organization in a lot of ways. So those ad hoc solutions don't necessarily improve security. They will get you through an audit. You get to keep the client, but that's maybe not the best approach. This gets into risk management. So the next one is risk management. This is considered a more proactive approach. Increasingly, we're seeing this in organizations. This is more common in larger organizations. It's becoming more common in smaller organizations. This is when the leadership of an organization makes a decision to monitor their security and to improve it over time. So the risk assessment and management component will actually tailor security to the organization based on what type of business you're in and what specific risks to your information there are in your organization. This actually can help drive investment too. You can find gaps once you get into a risk management structure where you see that you have a lot of security in one place and not so much in another, and both of those places are equally important to have security, and so it can be used to justify expenditures for added security. And the last one is regulatory compliance. I'm sure at least some of you are dealing with GDPR right now. That's a pretty hot item, the right to be forgotten. This continues to drive change and should be on anybody's roadmap, especially if they're doing business in different marketplaces and in different countries and things along those lines. And my sense of regulatory compliance specifically with all of the conversations that are happening right now around privacy and security, that we will probably expect to see some more of this coming down the pipe. So that's what's changing the game. I'll hand it back off to Matt. We could talk about some more specific configurations.
So what we traditionally do with iManage, we start up our server, we build our server, we start up our client, we click trusted logon, we're good, we're secure, right? Okay, that's the traditional model. RPC communication, everybody knows what that is. That's how it's talking to the server back and forth. 1080, 1081, right? Okay. Traditional RPC communication, unencrypted. And generally, well, our acronym falls apart here, sorry. Unencrypted storage, right? Where's your storage? It's usually spun off of a SAN, maybe local on the box, and it's not encrypted. Okay, so this is where we are now. We're all on a level playing. It's not anybody's fault, right? Maybe our fault, I don't know. But it's not anybody's fault because this is the way we traditionally did it, okay? A vendor would come in like me and say, what do you want? I want iManage, okay? We do this, this, and this because that's the way we've always done it. We can't do it that way anymore. We just can't, especially if you're considering the cloud, okay? So trusted authentication, bye-bye with the cloud. It's gone, okay? So you're going to need to think about this. And a lot of the times, and this is, again, Chuck, don't fire me for this, but even in a sales endeavor, when you start talking to your sales people, generally you don't come up with this idea of, well, what about my authentication? What about, maybe I might need SAML. Or how am I going to, maybe I'll use network authentication. And like I said, that blank silence that you get on the other side of the phone is our fault. All right, because we have not educated you to tell you, what do I need to do before I put in Work 10, before I go to the cloud? Because there are some investments that will give you a greater return with iManage that you have to do before you put your servers in. So let's talk about on-premise. Anybody going to do Work 10 on-premise before eventually going to the cloud? Okay, Work 10 on-premise? Okay, good, good. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with doing Work 10 on-premise. That is a very viable configuration. Now, iManage would want you to go to the cloud. I think I spend most of my time doing the cloud. But there are compelling reasons to remain on-premise. You talk about a lot of the integrations that you need. You still want the SQL access. You're not quite ready to make that move to lose SQL access. So you want to continue to support iManage on-premise. However, what I've found with most people who put Work 10 in on-premise, they never use the web client. It's there. They spent all this time setting up a 32 gigs of memory preview server, but they don't use it because they're not quite sure, is it secure or not? Like, can they use this from the outside, or should they use this from the outside, or is it just an internal thing? And so it kind of sits there, and everybody just kind of goes traditionally using their desk site and their file site and things like that. So we want to kind of help you break that cycle, right? That cycle cannot continue. We can't continue to meet security requirements, can't continue to meet security audits. We can't continue to sleep at night knowing that that's the way we did things before. So explicit authentication, trusted, is still around. You can still leave that box checked. We don't want you to. Most people haven't put Kerberos in. There's some spins you got to create. It's a little bit confusing. Network authentication, why bother? Because why should people enter their password in twice? And we'll talk about SAML. And SAML has value even internally. Okay, there should be more people who have SAML. Because SAML provides the best experience for the iManage Work 10. It provides the best experience. Network authentication is an option, but SAML, even on-premise, provides the best experience. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. Communication. So communication, I talked about 1080, 1081 for communication. At minimum, if you're going to go to Work 10, you should be checking that box that says HTTPS for Work Anywhere. You should be doing that on your client side. Okay, now there's some ramifications of doing that we'll give you a little free consulting here. Nick's going to do that for us. Going to give us a little free consulting. That if you just check that box and you're like, okay, I'm going to click connect, and it connects, whoop, I'm done. Hold on a second. There's some more implications to turning on HTTPS internally for communication that might meet the eye. So Nick's going to talk a little bit about diving into that communication portion. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about the cloud.
All right. So as Matt mentioned, there are some considerations around creating or enabling encryption in an environment, whether that's communication or storage. So let's talk a little bit about the communication piece. And here I just want to touch on the different types of certificates. So if you're deploying an environment, being aware of what work needs to be done to secure the data that you're going to be sending around with your certificates. First, we'll touch on this, a self-signed certificate. Self-signed certificate is when a device or a server on your network generates its own certificate. It creates a public-private key pair, which we'll talk about a little bit in a later slide as well. These are effective. None of these certificates are inherently less secure than the others. It's just that they require more work to configure some over others. A self-signed certificate is going to require that any device or client that connects to a server or device has that certificate loaded in there. So there's no implied trust between the client and the device that created the self-signed certificate. So there's a little extra work there. The internal certificate authority, these are also known as PKI systems. They can be a little more difficult to set up internally. They require management. They can improve security for things other than iManage. You can integrate a lot of things into using a PKI or internal certificate authority. And what happens with the CA, or the internal certificate authority, is, for example, in an iManage server or deployment, instead of doing a self-signed certificate on the device, your certificate authority would generate the certificate. And then you install the private key for that certificate on the server. Any device in your network that trusts that certificate authority is going to know that it can trust the iManage server in this instance, or the device that you installed that certificate. They have what's called a chain of trust. So it's implied because the certificate authority trusts the server and it also trusts you, it can connect those dots, and then your clients will trust the server as well. The third type is a third-party certificate. Very common for web applications. Anything that's outside facing to your organization, you're going to want a third-party certificate. And what happens is that this is very similar to your internal CA, except for it's global across the internet. So you have to purchase these. They come at a cost. But what they do is there's a chain of trust all the way up to whoever you bought the certificate from, whether it's Network Solutions or GoDaddy, that allows a client to trust your server because you paid to get a certificate that that client already will trust. So anything that a web client connects to, you're going to want one of those. Okay, and so as Matt alluded to earlier, there's also some considerations when you secure your communications internally, particularly around HTTPS. What's worth noting about HTTPS and encryption is that, first of all, WAN optimization does not work. So if you're using WAN optimization to a data center or anything along those lines to move your files around, it's going to be a lot less efficient, if efficient at all. The reason for this is the way that your optimizers will work, your WAN optimizers. They look for patterns in your data. So if you're sending, you say 24 characters, we'll use an example, 24 characters, 8 letter A's, 8 letter B's, 8 letter C's, the optimizer is actually going to take that data and create shorthand for it. It's going to say A/8, B/8, C/8. And what you've done is you've gone from 24 characters to 9 characters. It sends that over to the other WAN optimizer, and that knows how to read the shorthands, recreates the data, and moves along. It's just worth noting that because just by checking that HTTPS box, if you're using that, you're going to see a significant reduction in performance, especially if you're using a link that has limited bandwidth, something along those lines. It's also worth noting double encryption. I'll make a point for the WAN optimization. There are ways around that. You can still optimize the traffic. It just can't be, you have to compress it before it's encrypted. So, and devices can actually unencrypt the data, compress it, and then re-encrypt it and send it. It just has to be planned out because encryption takes CPU cycles, RAM, things like that. So if you're not planning from a hardware perspective to be able to do that, you're going to run into your performance impacts. And then the other thing worth noting is double encryption. It doesn't help if your encryption doesn't encrypt it right the first time, it's not going to get it the second time, and you're just burning more CPU cycles. So if you have a bottleneck in the architecture somewhere with how it's being implemented, this can just drag down the performance and the client experience as well. So that handles our communication, our data in transit, it's often called. We'll get into the data at rest. Data at rest is an important thing to have configured. And I've had conversations where people didn't necessarily know where the value for data at rest came from. They didn't necessarily understand where that value was. It's really a backstop. Encryption at rest is a backstop in case other things break down, operational or personnel things break down. So encryption is that backstop. As a rule of thumb, encryption closer to the disk is better, closer to the data. Self-encrypting drives are really the best. As with everything, it's a balance between cost and value. SAN controllers can actually encrypt as well, so that's still pretty close. You have to control the keys and stuff when you do that. What's more often happens is a whole disk encryption. We use BitLocker here. It comes integrated with Windows. The key management is fairly simple with Active Directory, things along those lines. Often the choice that firms make because it is effective with a minimal impact and cost to an organization. EFS is a file level encryption for data at rest. It doesn't really give you any advantages over full disk encryption with some additional management and the potential for data leakage when you get into the nuts and bolts of it. Not something I recommend at this point. And then not to forget the client, the devices that connect to your servers and pull the data down. They don't have the same size repositories as your servers, but they're far more likely to be lost or stolen. So just making sure that those are encrypted so you don't lose data that way is important.
Let's talk about the cloud a little bit, specifically authentication. And as I mentioned before, trusted encryptors are gone. Okay, they're no longer, you can't check that box with trusted logon anymore. Now, particularly when you look at your compelling reasons to go to Work 10, generally it surrounds some kind of upgrade cycle on your client, correct? I mean, that's what most people do. Most people say, I'm going to go to Work 10 because I need to support Windows 10, I need to support Office 2016, I need to support a new client. So your client supports all these authentication mechanisms. However, if you notice, the trusted plus sign goes away there in the cloud. And if you look at explicit, it's no longer integrated with Active Directory. So explicit logon, for those that don't know, is you have a separate iManage password that you have to enter into the client that is generated for you when you set up your cloud environment that is specific to that user. Now it can expire, but generally it's different than your network password, than your Active Directory password. So there's a lot of overhead in trying to maintain explicit authentication. However, when you're going to the cloud, you still need explicit authentication turned on because your workspace generator, your CL load, still need to connect through explicit authentication. Now, there's tools that are coming out that support the new REST API, which is beyond the scope of this discussion here. Everything's kind of moving that direction, right? So we may get to the point where explicit is no longer necessary, but initially, for most folks moving to the cloud, we still have to have explicit turned on. Network authentication. This is the one that we generally fall back to as consultants when they want Active Directory integrated authentication. Now, if you notice there's a star next to SSO there, I'll talk about the star in just a minute, but it's not really true SSO. Now, the reason why it's not true SSO is because it's really not true single sign-on. When you log into your client and you put in, you start up your machine, you put in your password, you launch DeskSite, the first time that you connect, it's going to ask you to enter in your username, which would match your iManage and your network login, and you have to enter in your password. Okay? You hit save. Now, that password gets stored, and so you can click auto login and everything's fine. 90 days comes around, and all of a sudden, you change your network password on your machine, and you know what happens the next time you launch DeskSite? You're going to get a prompt, okay? Because your password is expired. So it's not true SSO. And the other problem with it is there's a lot of overhead in configuration. I was talking to John's in the back there. We were bemoaning the setup of network authentication for cloud environments. You can do it, and we can help you do it. However, it's very cumbersome. You need certificate services installed, which usually requires a separate server. You would never want to put it on your domain controller, right? With IIS installed to generate the certificate request. We ran into this problem with another client. We had these problems to generate certificate requests internally, and also you have to open up port 636 to be able to have the iManage server be able to authenticate against your Active Directory domain controller. And we all see that that's somewhat of a problem. Now, there's security related to that as far as the port coming in. You can restrict the ports only from iManage. But again, just a lot of work, a lot of potential for error. Okay, we want to try to avoid it. If you can't afford SAML, it's a viable option. It's very viable, but it's going to require its own set of overhead. For SAML, you get a lot more bang for your buck. A lot of you folks have existing web applications that need to be authenticated internally and externally. Okay, so SAML is not just an iManage requirement. It's going to be a requirement for your entire organization going forward. So a lot of you have implemented SAML. You probably go to the SAML and you probably have 10, 15 applications that you're already authenticating through SAML today. So multi-factor authentication. You can layer multi-factor. We've had some clients come to us and say, I want to do multi-factor with iManage Cloud, but I don't have a SAML solution. It just doesn't, it's not going to happen. Okay, so if you want to do multi-factor, you're going to have to consider putting in a SAML solution if you don't have one already. Custom rules. Some people set up custom rules where you can only authenticate to SAML internally, but you can't get to it from the outside. So you're able to do that with your SAML provider to restrict access from certain IPs or from certain locations in your network. Federation, we talked about that. It's basically the same credentials that you use for Active Directory, and they stay in sync. So if your Active Directory password expires and you put it into SAML, it's going to be your new password. It's not going to be the one that was previously. Mobility. All the mobility, iOS mobility supports SAML. So if you go to log in through mobility, you're going to get your SAML authentication. You're going to get your dual factor, just as if you would on any other device. Windows Integrated Authentication and Forms. Windows Integrated Authentication is a really nice feature to have when you're doing SAML. They launch DeskSite, a little SAML authentication comes up, it closes, you're in. Okay? Forms-based authentication means that you get a form, it sticks up on the window, and sometimes you have to put in for like a dual factor authentication. And a lot of people who use that inside and outside the firewall would prefer that. So if you always want a multi-factor prompt, you're going to use forms-based authentication. We love SAML. So Nick's going to talk a little bit more about SAML.
So SAML, as Matt mentioned, great bang for your buck. From a security perspective, first of all, this is an opportunity where security can actually enhance the user experience, which the stereotype is quite the opposite, that security is going to slow things down. This is an opportunity to speed it up and improve security. For anybody who's considering leveraging any cloud resources, whether it be iManage or not, identity and authentication is one of the core things that an organization still has control over, even if they outsource the infrastructure to other services and organizations. So SAML is it's effective, it's easy to use, and it allows an organization, it's future-proof. It allows an organization to integrate things, iManage, Office 365, any cloud application can leverage this same implementation. So I'm going to walk quickly through this. I'm sorry if I lose you. I'm going to move through it pretty quickly. An ID provider is at the core of SAML. So that could be Active Directory federated services. There's some cloud solutions that provide you with identity management as well. Azure does it. And that really is the core of all your users. It stores what groups they belong to, the security groups, attributes, email addresses, all the information about the user is stored there, and all the services that are integrated with SAML will go to that same spot to determine whether it's a valid user or not. So when a user opens up an application, they go to use a service somewhere, that service provider will look to see whether there's an existing session set up for that user. If there's not, that service tells the browser for that user, hey, I need you to go over to this ID provider and get authenticated before I can let you in. And that service provider will actually automatically redirect the browser with the service that they're trying to access over to the ID provider. That ID provider will receive that. They see what service the user's trying to access, and they will go through the process of authenticating them. The ID provider can authenticate all the ways that Matt just mentioned, integrated authentication, Windows integrated, multi-factor authentication, however it's configured to use that service, it's going to authenticate that user. Once that user is authenticated, it's going to take and build what's called a SAML token. And what happens is that token is, first of all, it says that that user passed the authentication piece, and then it also knows what attributes the service provider needs, whether it's a username, whether it's the security group they belong to. The ID provider knows all that information. It packages it all up into that token and then encrypts that token and then sends the user's web browser back over to the service provider with that token attached. And that service provider will go to unencrypt that data using a key that the ID provider and the service provider have both already shared. If it can do that, it knows it's a valid user, and then it has a list of all of the attributes that user has for that service. It lets them in, gives them access to whatever's appropriate for them to have access to, and all of that can happen in the background without even the user necessarily being aware of it, depending on how it's configured. Getting into encryption key, this is following our theme of ACE. This is how data is in transit is encrypted. This could be how your bank works. Anything and everything that you do that has that green lock on the top of your browser, this is how it works. We mentioned the session encryption key at first. When you first go to the service, it looks to see if you're already validated. It does that by checking for a session encryption key. If that doesn't exist, there's a process for getting a session key, and that is with the certificates that we talked about earlier. There's a private and public key. They're connected through a mathematical formula that hurts my head to think about. But what it means is that you can encrypt the data with a public key, and only the private key can unlock it. So your browser makes up a random session key, encrypts it with a public key, and then the website that you're trying to log into is the only one that's able to unencrypt it with their private key. Once that happens, the session key has been shared secretly over the internet, and the rest of your conversation is considered encrypted and secure with that green checkbox at the top of your browser. Just to wrap up on the encryption at rest, this is a diagram of how iManage Cloud works now. This is a cloud-specific diagram. We already touched on how HTTPS is established over the internet securely. And what happens is when you go to access data in iManage Cloud, their server will actually reach out to a specialized device. It's called an HSM. These devices are designed exclusively for key management and encryption. They are hardened, their operating system's hardened. They're not susceptible to data leakage, even through like power usage and all the crazy things that you can do to steal data. These devices they're called FIPS compliant, FIPS 140. it's just a standardized model for how you secure these particular devices, and it makes sure that they're not prone to leaking your keys. And so this is how this happens now. One thing to note in the current implementation of iManage is they hold those private keys. So they technically could have access to the data. They have what's called a SOC report, which is designed to make everybody comfortable that nobody is able to get to the data through an operational perspective, but they do hold the private keys. Now, I forget when the BYOK?
May.
May.
It's coming out now.
They've just released a BYOK for the roadmap.
Or customer managed encryption keys.
Customer managed encryption keys. It's named something different. What that does is it allows an organization to actually create their own private key, store it in something like Azure, and then every time data needs to be unencrypted, this HSM actually has to reach out to Azure and access your private key. And what that does is it gives an organization the logs, the access logs, and control over that data. If for some reason you wanted to remove that key, you could basically know that your data on the drives in any data center, wherever it may be, will be encrypted and only you have access to unencrypt it.
Best practices, right? That's what you want walking out the door, okay? SAML. If you haven't looked at SAML and you're looking at iManage Work 10, take a hard look, okay? Your experience is going to be better for most users. Actually, you can get subscription SAML services. Not everybody has to put their own SAML solution in-house. Just wanted to say that. A couple dollars a month, you can go and get a SAML provider. It's completely hosted in the cloud, and you can have SAML for your iManage work. HTTPS, if you're not doing HTTPS, you need to do it now. Okay? If internally or externally, that's the protocol mechanism. We want it all the way across the board, whether you're accessing the web, iOS, the client, authentication, it's all HTTPS. Encryption, bring your own key. We're almost there, 3rd week of May. That's the release date for 10.1.3. And then if you have an in-house, you generate your own key, it's bring your own key. Okay? So if nobody else has access to it, you're the only one. So these are the 3 things we want you to walk away with. Again, if you haven't looked at SAML, it's going to be an experience for you to get that user adoption. It's going to be easy for them to get in. Encryption, you're going to sleep at night. And HTTPS, nobody's going to be able to see your data as it's in transit between iManage and your client. Chuck's going to wrap us up.
I think Matt said it best. Everybody here is so anxious to get their project started, to kick off your Work 10 upgrade or to move to the cloud, and we're guilty as well as systems integrators. It's let's get started, let's get the project going. But I think the one takeaway we want to remind you is as your project commences and you start thinking about it, remember the ACE acronym that we spoke about. Did you walk through authentication? Have you thought about the communications protocol? Have you thought about encryption so that you can provide a very secure document management system to your firm, to your organization, and to your user community? And when you get those security audits and compliance checks that Nick talked about, can you finally check those boxes and not make up the answer that we're working on that or that we're getting towards a resolution? We hear that all too much, that firms are trying to find a way to work through that process. What we're saying is when you enter the project and you start, take one step back. And the message that we always try to say is there a security implication in the design decision that we're making? Can we make it more secure when we move forward? Thank you so much for your time. Our contact information is up there if you have any questions. She also reminded me to say follow the social media channels because we're publishing good information up there. The people like Matt and Nick are publishing knowledge articles, case studies, and also educational events that we're hosting. So we'd love to keep in touch with you all. And thank you very much for attending our session. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.